While you were gone, you probably didn't even realize how loud your silence became in someone else's world, because the moment you stepped back and chose distance, someone else quietly stepped into the space you left behind, and instead of ignoring it, they felt it deeply. They noticed every small thing that changed, every moment that didn't feel the same, and slowly, they began to understand that your presence was never ordinary, it was never just routine, it was something rare, something grounding, something that held more meaning than anyone had the courage to admit when you were still there. You thought everything would go back to normal, like it always does. People adjust, people move on, people learn to live without what they once had, but this time it didn't happen that way, because your absence didn't create distance, it created awareness, it forced someone to sit with the truth they had been avoiding for so long, that you were never just an option, never just someone who could be replaced, never just a temporary chapter that would fade without leaving a mark. Days passed, but instead of things becoming easier, they became heavier, because every passing moment carried a reminder of what was missing, your words, your presence, your quiet understanding that used to make everything feel a little less complicated, a little more manageable, a little more real. They began to replay memories in their mind, the way you used to listen without interrupting, the way you noticed the smallest details that no one else ever paid attention to, the way you stayed even when things were uncertain, even when it wasn't convenient, even when you had every reason to walk away. And now, in your absence, those memories didn't just stay as memories, they turned into realizations, each one stronger than the last, each one reminding them that what they had with you was never ordinary, it was something people search for their entire lives and still fail to find. There were moments when they tried to convince themselves that it didn't matter, that they could move on, that they could fill the space you left with something or someone else, but no matter how hard they tried, nothing felt the same, nothing carried the same warmth, the same comfort, the same quiet sense of belonging that your presence once brought into their life. Conversations felt incomplete, laughter felt forced, and even in a room full of people, there was a kind of emptiness that refused to go away, because deep down, they knew that what they were missing wasn't just a person, it was you, and everything that came with you. And that's when the truth started to settle in, slowly but surely, that losing you wasn't just about absence, it was about realization, it was about understanding too late that what they had was real, it was rare, it was something they should have held onto with both hands instead of taking it for granted. They began to see the moments they overlooked, the times they didn't respond with the same energy you gave, the times they assumed you would always be there no matter what, and now, those moments came back to them with a weight they couldn't ignore, because now they understood what it meant to lose someone who truly cared. Your absence became a mirror, reflecting everything they failed to see when you were still around, showing them the value they didn't recognize, the effort they didn't appreciate, the love they didn't fully understand. And the hardest part wasn't just missing you, it was knowing that you had given them something genuine, something pure, something that didn't come with conditions, and they didn't treat it the way it deserved to be treated. That realization stayed with them, growing stronger with each passing day, turning into something they couldn't escape, something that changed the way they saw everything. Because now, they understood that people like you don't come into someone's life again and again, they are rare, they are once in a lifetime, and when they leave, they take a part of that world with them that can never truly be replaced. And maybe that's what this was meant to be, not just an ending, not just a distance, but a lesson, a realization, a moment of truth that showed them what they lost and why it mattered so much, even if they realized it a little too late, and as time kept moving forward, they slowly began to understand that this wasn't just a phase, it wasn't just a temporary feeling that would fade away with distractions or new people. It was something deeper, something that settled into their thoughts and stayed there, quietly reminding them of you in the most unexpected moments. It showed up in the silence after a long day, when there was no one who truly understood how they felt the way you did. It appeared in small habits, like reaching for their phone to share something with you, only to realize that you were no longer there to receive it, and in that brief second, everything felt heavier than it should have. They started noticing how different things felt without you, how conversations lacked depth, how connections felt surface level, how even laughter didn't carry the same meaning anymore, because what you gave them was never just attention, it was presence, real presence, the kind that made people feel seen without needing to explain themselves. And now, without that, everything felt slightly off, slightly incomplete, like a story missing its most important chapter. At times, they tried to convince themselves that they were overthinking, that maybe they were just holding on to memories longer than they should, but the truth had already rooted itself too deeply to be ignored, because no matter how far they tried to run from it, they kept circling back to the same realization, that you mattered more than they ever admitted, more than they ever showed, more than they even understood at the time. Regret began to creep in, not all at once, but slowly, in layers, as they started remembering the moments they took for granted, the times you waited for them to understand you, the times you gave without expecting anything in return, the times you stayed patient even when things were uncertain. And now, looking back, those moments felt different, they felt heavier, because now they saw them clearly, without ego, without distraction, without the assumption that you would always be there no matter what. There was a quiet kind of guilt that followed them, not loud enough for the world to see, but strong enough to change the way they thought, the way they felt, the way they looked at everything that reminded them of you. It wasn't just about missing you anymore, it was about wishing they had done things differently, wishing they had spoken more honestly, appreciated more openly, stayed more present instead of assuming time would always be on their side. And yet, despite everything, there was also a strange kind of clarity that came with your absence, a clarity that only distance can bring, because sometimes people don't truly understand what they have until they no longer have it, and by the time they do, the moment has already passed. They began to realize that what you gave them wasn't something ordinary, it wasn't something easily replaceable, it was something rare, something genuine, something that came from a place of real care, and that kind of thing doesn't come around often. They saw how you had been there in ways no one else ever was, how you understood things they never had to explain, how you stayed consistent in a world where everything else felt temporary, and now that consistency was gone, leaving behind a space that couldn't be filled, no matter how hard they tried. Sometimes, late at night, when everything was quiet and there were no distractions left, they found themselves thinking about you, not in a dramatic way, not in a way they could easily express, but in a quiet, lingering way that stayed with them, reminding them of conversations unfinished, feelings unspoken, and moments that now only existed in memory. And in those moments, they understood something they hadn't before, that losing you wasn't just about losing a person, it was about losing a version of themselves that only existed when you were around. Because with you, things felt different, they felt more real, more grounded, more honest, and without you, there was a part of that reality that simply faded away. And maybe that's what hurt the most, not just your absence, but the realization of everything that came with it, everything they didn't fully see when you were still there, everything they now wished they had valued more. And even though life continued, even though days kept passing and things kept changing, there was always a part of them that carried this realization, this quiet understanding that some people come into your life for a reason, and even if they leave behind something that changes you forever. And you were that kind of person, the kind that doesn't just pass through someone's life, but the kind that leaves a mark so deep that it stays, long after you're gone, long after everything else has moved on, long after the world expects you to forget. But they didn't forget, not really, because some connections aren't meant to be forgotten, they are meant to be understood, even if that understanding comes a little too late, even if it comes after everything has already changed, because in the end, your absence became their lesson, their realization, their quiet truth that they would carry with them, a reminder that what they once had was real, rare, and something they may never find again. And somewhere between trying to move on and unknowingly holding on, they found themselves stuck in a space that felt unfamiliar yet deeply personal, a space where everything looked normal from the outside but inside, nothing felt the same anymore, because your absence didn't just take you away, it shifted something within them, something they couldn't easily explain to anyone else, something that quietly changed the way they experienced everything around them, from the smallest conversations to the biggest moments, because now there was always this underlying awareness, this constant reminder that something meaningful was missing, and no matter how much they tried to fill that space with distractions, with noise, with new faces or temporary happiness, it never quite reached the place you once occupied, it never carried the same depth, the same effortless understanding, the same unspoken comfort that came so naturally with you. And that's when they began to realize that what they lost wasn't just a connection, it was a kind of peace they didn't even know they had, a kind of emotional safety that made everything feel a little less heavy, a little less complicated, a little more manageable, and now without it, even the simplest things required more effort, more thought, more energy, because you were no longer there to balance things out in the quiet way you always did, and this realization didn't come as a sudden wave, it came slowly, settling into their routine, blending into their everyday life, until one day they looked around and noticed that even though everything seemed the same, they felt different, they responded differently, they thought differently, and most importantly, they felt the absence of something real, something genuine, something they once had but didn't fully understand at the time, and that's when the weight of it all truly hit them, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, undeniable truth that stayed with them no matter where they went or what they did, because deep down, they knew that people like you don't just appear in someone's life without reason, they come with a purpose, with a kind of presence that leaves an impact whether it stays forever or not, and even though you were no longer there, the impact you left behind continued to exist in everything they did, in the way they approached relationships, in the way they valued honesty, in the way they started to recognize the difference between something temporary and something real, because now they had experienced both, and that experience changed them in ways they couldn't ignore, in ways that made them more aware, more careful, more thoughtful about what they hold on to and what they risk losing, and with that awareness came a quiet kind of regret, not the kind that seeks attention or sympathy, but the kind that sits silently in the background, reminding them of moments they wish they could go back to, words they wish they had said differently, feelings they wish they had expressed more clearly, because now they understood that not everything lasts forever, not every person stays, and not every chance comes back once it's gone, and even though they tried to make peace with that thought, it wasn't easy, because some realizations don't come with closure, they come with acceptance, and acceptance takes time. it takes patience, it takes a willingness to sit with the truth even when it's uncomfortable, even when it hurts in ways that aren't visible to others, and that's exactly what they were learning to do, slowly, quietly, without making a big deal out of it, just carrying it with them as they moved forward, trying to grow from it instead of running from it, trying to understand it instead of denying it, because deep down, they knew that this wasn't just about losing you, it was about becoming someone who would never make the same mistake again, someone who would recognize value when they see it. Someone who would appreciate presence while it's still there instead of waiting until it's gone, and maybe that's what made this whole experience so significant, not just the loss, not just the realization, but the transformation that came with it, the way it reshaped their perspective, the way it taught them lessons they wouldn't have learned otherwise, the way it made them pause and reflect on everything they once took for granted, because sometimes it takes losing something real to truly understand what real even means, and now they understood it in a way they never had before, not just as an idea, but as a lived experience, something they felt deeply, something that stayed with them long after you were gone, something that became a part of who they were becoming, and even though they couldn't change the past, even though they couldn't go back and undo what had already been done, they carried forward the lesson, the awareness, the quiet understanding that what they had with you was rare, and even if it didn't last forever, it mattered in ways that would continue to shape them, guide them, remind them of the kind of connection that doesn't come around often, and in that sense, you were never truly gone, because the impact you left behind stayed, woven into their thoughts, their growth, their understanding of what it means to truly value someone, and maybe that's the part that was always meant to happen. Not just the meeting, not just the losing, but the learning that followed, the realization that came after everything changed, the quiet truth that some people don't just come into your life to stay, they come to show you something real, something rare, something you will carry with you long after they are no longer by your side, and even though they wished they had realized it sooner, even though they wished things had turned out differently, they couldn't deny that this experience, this connection, this loss, had changed them in a way nothing else ever had, and maybe, just maybe, that's why it was meant to happen exactly the way it did, and even after all this understanding, all this silent growth, there were still moments when everything felt unfinished, like a story that reached a turning point but never truly found its ending, because no matter how much they tried to accept things as they were, a part of them kept going back, not to change the past, but to understand it more deeply, to figure out where things shifted, where they failed to see what was right in front of them, where they let something so real slowly slip through their hands without realizing its weight, and this thought didn't come with noise or chaos, it came quietly, almost like a whisper in their mind that refused to fade, reminding them that sometimes the biggest mistakes aren't loud, they are subtle, they happen in the moments we overlook, in the things we assume will always be there, in the feelings we think we can express later, until later turns into never, and by the time we look back, everything has already changed, and that's exactly what this had become for them, a quiet turning point that reshaped the way they saw everything, because now they didn't just remember you, they understood you, they understood the effort you put in without expecting recognition, the patience you carried even when things were uncertain, the way you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. And this understanding came with a kind of emotional depth they had never experienced before, because it wasn't based on assumption anymore, it was based on realization, on clarity, on the truth that only becomes visible when something is no longer there to be taken for granted, and with that clarity came a shift in the way they looked at people, at connections, at the idea of presence itself, because now they knew that not everyone who stays truly cares. And not everyone who cares always stays, and you were the rare kind who did both, and losing. That made them more aware of how uncommon it really was, how easy it is to overlook something genuine when it becomes familiar, how quickly people adapt to consistency and start treating it like it's guaranteed, when in reality, nothing ever is, and this realization stayed with them in ways they couldn't ignore, shaping their thoughts, guiding their actions, making them pause before repeating the same patterns, because deep down, they didn't want to experience that kind of loss again, not because it was painful, but because it was meaningful, and meaningful losses leave a different kind of mark, one that doesn't fade easily, one that stays as a reminder of what was real and what was missed, and even though they were moving forward, even though life continued to unfold in new ways, there was always a part of them that carried this awareness, this quiet understanding that some connections are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be remembered, not with regret alone, but with respect, with appreciation, with a sense of gratitude for what they were, even if they didn't last forever, and in that sense, you became more than just someone from their past, you became a reference point, a standard, a reminder of what it feels like to experience something genuine, something that doesn't come with conditions or expectations, something that simply exists in its purest form. And that kind of experience changes a person, it changes the way they approach everything that comes after, it makes them more intentional, more aware, more careful about what they choose to hold on to and what they risk losing, and maybe that's what made your absence so powerful, not just the emptiness it created, but the clarity it brought, the way it forced them to see things they were too distracted to notice before, the way it made them understand the difference between something temporary and something real. And even though this understanding came a little too late, it still mattered, because it shaped them into someone who would never look at genuine connections the same way again, someone who would recognize value when they see it, someone who would not wait for absence to create appreciation, and even though they couldn't go back and change what had already happened, they carried this lesson with them as they moved forward, quietly, steadily, without needing to explain it to anyone else, because some lessons are personal, they are meant to be felt, not spoken, meant to be lived, not explained, and this was one of them, a silent transformation that didn't need validation, didn't need acknowledgement, it simply existed within them, guiding them in ways they didn't fully understand yet, but would continue to unfold over time. And maybe that's the part that truly mattered, not just what was lost, but what was learned, not just the ending, but the meaning it left behind, because in the end, some people don't just leave a memory, they leave a change, a shift, a realization that stays with you long after they are gone, and you were exactly that, not just someone who came and went, but someone who changed the way they see everything, someone who made them understand what real feels like, even if they realized it only after you were gone, and maybe, just maybe, that's why it all happened the way it did, not to break something, but to reveal something, something deeper, something honest, something that would stay with them long after everything else had faded, because some stories are not meant to end perfectly, they are meant to teach, to shape, to leave behind a truth that becomes a part of you, and this was one of those stories, and even with all that growth, all that understanding slowly settling into their heart, there were still days when the weight of it all felt heavier than usual, not because they hadn't accepted reality, but because acceptance doesn't erase feeling, it just teaches you how to carry it, and carrying something meaningful is never easy, especially when it's tied to someone who once made everything feel effortless, because now even the simplest emotions required more thought, more awareness, more control, as if they were constantly reminding themselves not to fall back into what once felt natural. And in those moments they realized something even deeper, that what made you different wasn't just how you treated them, it was how you made them feel about themselves, how you created a space where they didn't have to overthink, didn't have to question their worth, didn't have to second-guess every word or every silence, and that kind of comfort is rare, so rare that people often don't recognize it until it's no longer there, and now that it was gone, they saw it clearly. They felt it in the contrast between what was and what is. They noticed how everything else felt slightly incomplete, slightly forced, slightly less real, and it wasn't because nothing else was good, it was because what they had with you had set a standard they didn't even know existed, a standard built on understanding, consistency, and something deeper than surface-level connection, something that didn't need constant validation to feel real, something that simply existed and made everything around it feel lighter. And losing that didn't just create absence, it created awareness, an awareness that stayed with them in every interaction, every conversation, every new connection, because now they could tell the difference between something that was temporary and something that had depth, something that was just there and something that truly mattered. And this awareness changed the way they moved through life. It made them slower to trust, but more honest when they did. It made them more careful with people's feelings, but also more aware of their own. It made them understand that not every connection is meant to last, but the ones that do matter deserve to be valued while they are still present, not after they're gone. And maybe that was the hardest part of all. Not just realizing your worth, but realizing it too late, realizing it when there was nothing left to do about it except carry the lesson forward, and even though they tried not to dwell on that thought, it stayed somewhere in the background, quietly reminding them of what could have been if things were different, if they had seen things sooner, if they had understood what they had before it slipped away. But life doesn't move backwards. It doesn't pause for realization, it keeps going, and so did they, step by step, day by day, learning how to live with both the memory and the meaning, learning how to turn something that once felt like loss into something that now felt like growth, even if that growth came with a sense of quiet sadness. Because not all growth feels good, some of it comes from understanding things you wish you had known earlier, from accepting truths you weren't ready to face before, from letting go of something that once felt like it would always be there, and yet, despite all of that, there was also something beautiful hidden within it, something that gave this entire experience a kind of purpose, because through you, they learned what real connection feels like. Through you, they understood the value of presence, the importance of appreciation, the difference between something that is convenient and something that is meaningful, and those lessons didn't fade, they stayed, becoming a part of who they were becoming, shaping their future in ways they couldn't fully see yet, but would eventually understand. And maybe that's what made your presence so powerful, not just the way it felt when it was there, but the way it continued to influence everything even after it was gone. The way it left behind something deeper than memory, something that turned into awareness, into growth, into a quiet understanding that would guide them in ways they didn't expect. And even though they couldn't rewrite the past, they could choose how they moved forward. They could choose to be better, to see clearer, to value deeper, and in that choice, there was a kind of closure, not the kind that erases everything, but the kind that allows you to carry it without breaking under its weight, the kind that turns something painful into something meaningful, something that stays with you not as a regret, but as a reminder of what real felt like, of what it meant to have something genuine, even if only for a while. And maybe that's the truth they finally came to accept, that some people aren't meant to stay forever, but that doesn't make what they brought into your life any less real, any less important, any less impactful, because in the end, it's not always about how long something lasts. It's about how deeply it changes you, and you, without even trying, change them in ways they will carry for the rest of their life, in the way they think, in the way they feel, in the way they understand what truly matters. And even though they may never say it out loud, even though they may never get the chance to express it directly to you, that truth lives within them, quietly, constantly, shaping who they are becoming, reminding them that what they once had was real, rare, and something that will always mean more than they were able to show when you were still there. And maybe that's what makes this story incomplete yet complete at the same time. Because even without an ending, it still holds meaning, it still carries a lesson, it still leaves behind something that continues to exist, long after everything else has moved on, and in that sense, you were never just a moment in their life, you were a turning point, a realization, a silent chapter that didn't need closure to matter, because its impact was already enough to last far beyond the time you were actually there, and maybe, in the end, that's what everything was leading to. Not a perfect reunion, not a dramatic closure, but a quiet understanding that settled deep within them, the kind that doesn't need words, doesn't need explanations, because it simply becomes a part of who they are, and who they are becoming, because somewhere along the way, they stopped asking why things ended the way they did, and started understanding why it all happened in the first place. Because some people don't come into your life just to stay, they come to change you, to shift something inside you that you didn't even know needed to change, and you did that. Without even trying, without forcing anything, just by being who you were, just by showing up in a way that felt real, consistent, and rare, and even though they didn't fully understand it back then, they understand it now, in a way that feels deeper, calmer, more honest, because now there is no ego left in it, no confusion, no assumptions, just clarity, just truth, just the quiet acceptance that what they had with you was something meaningful, something that wasn't meant to be taken lightly. And even if they did at the time, they don't anymore, and that realization, even if it came late, still matters, because it changed them, it made them more aware, more present, more real with themselves and with others, and as life continued to move forward, they didn't try to replace what they lost, they didn't try to recreate what they had with you in someone else, because deep down, they knew that some things are not meant to be repeated, they are meant to be remembered, respected, and learned from, and you became exactly that for them, not just a memory, but a standard, a reminder of what real connection feels like, and even though they kept going, kept growing, kept meeting new people and experiencing new things, there was always this quiet space within them that held your presence, not in a way that stopped them from moving on, but in a way that reminded them of what truly matters, of what deserves effort, of what should never be taken for granted again, and maybe that's the kind of ending this was always meant to have, not something loud or obvious, but something soft and lasting, something that stays with you in the background of your life, shaping your choices, guiding your heart, reminding you of a time when something real existed, even if it didn't last forever, because in the end, it was never about how long you stayed, it was about what you left behind. And what you left behind was something they could never ignore, something that became a part of their growth, their understanding, their truth, and even though they may never say it directly, even though life may take them in completely different directions, there will always be a part of them that quietly acknowledges you, not with regret anymore, but with respect, with gratitude, with a sense of peace that comes from finally understanding what they once had and why it mattered so much. And maybe that's enough, maybe that's more than enough, because not every story needs a perfect ending to be meaningful. Some stories just need to be real, and this one was real, from beginning to end, in ways that words will never fully be able to capture, but feelings always will.